All right, we're going to go now to Amber Smith, who was in Frankfurt, where the Cameron press conference occurred, and she's going to bring us some reaction from there. Amber.
Well, Lachlan, of course, it was a very full house in here. Obviously, this story having both local, national attention as well as across the world. What we know is 3 officers were in question. Only 1 will be facing any charges. Former LMPD officer Brett Hankinson is facing 3 counts of wanton endangerment. Certainly not what Breonna Taylor's family and her attorneys were pushing for. As you might recall, when we were at a settlement news conference last week, civil rights attorney Ben Crump says they were pushing for, at minimum, second-degree manslaughter. This is definitely not what we saw here, but we did learn a little bit about what Daniel Cameron's investigation uncovered as for the events that did lead up to what happened on March 13th. Something to note is he said that Kenneth Walker has admitted to firing the first shot, and a ballistics report does show that that was the shot that hit Mattingly when he was the first officer to enter the apartment. They also said that a witness did show that the officers knocked and announced themselves. That's something that has been under a lot of question as for what happened on that night. Of course, we don't have any body camera evidence. Cameron says that video footage doesn't start until patrol officers arrive long after. But what he was saying is for why the other 2 officers didn't face any charges, he says that because Kenneth Walker fired the first shot, those officers are justified in their actions because they were acting under self-defense. So the question is, why these charges with Hankinson? What they were saying is that he fired some shots from outside, firing through a window. What happened is that some bullets hit a separate apartment where a woman, man, and child lived. That's why the grand jury felt there was enough evidence to bring forth these charges. As for what happens next, if found guilty, he could face 5 years in prison for each of the 3 counts. That's going to be up to a court to decide whether he's guilty or innocent. Reporting in Frankfurt, Amber Smith, Spectrum News.
All right, thank you, Amber, for that report. And again, the Attorney General had a prepared opening statement, and then I would say took 20, 25 minutes of questions. And there were a lot of times he still could not provide the specificity that I think some people would like, saying that the grand jury process has to remain confidential. You could certainly understand as well, Kayla, that they want to protect the identity of these grand jurors, especially with this controversial outcome. And so he was very reticent to give details about the racial makeup of the grand jury. Certainly names, identification will not occur, but he just kept saying he gave them the information, and then they came to a decision. And again, the decision was justifiable force. All right. We believe Khyati Patel is joining us now with more reaction from Jefferson Square Park in downtown Louisville.
Yeah, I'm Khyati Patel at Spectrum News 1. We're at Jefferson Square Park. A lot of the protesters are consoling each other. Hugs, just mixed reactions have unfolded here at the square where Breonna Taylor's memorial is set right here. It continues to grow as more people are adding more things. But around the square as well, one statue right around the corner, they've started to add more signs, just asking for justice for Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. Just more and more signs are being put up around the square. But protesters right now are just spread out, consoling. A pastor I talked to said this is kind of like a slow burn as the news kind of sinks in of what unfolded just moments ago. He said also that people are feeling numb. And that's kind of what you can see here as people are just trying to make themselves busy with small activities, but also on the greater scale, just raking in what the news unfolded just minutes ago.
All right, thank you, Khyati. I thought that phrase was well used, slow burn. It feels like, as we've been witnessing, and obviously we're here in the studio, but what's going on as the protesters react to the Breonna Taylor decision. I'm Lachlan McClain, joined by Kayla Moody here live on Spectrum News 1.
Yeah, and if you're just joining us, we do want to catch you up to date on what has transpired today. Again, this follows months of protest, not only in Kentucky, but nationwide, after Breonna Taylor's name has really become a rallying cry for those who nationwide have been seeking police reform. We did learn today what the grand jury returned with, and what they decided was that former LMPD officer Brett Hankison, he has been indicted on 3 counts of wanton endangerment, all those first-degree charges. They are Class D felonies, each carrying a minimum of 1 year in prison, up to 5 years. Those, of course, were for firing into apartments around Breonna Taylor's, as well as her apartment from outside in a parking lot. You might remember that he was fired by LMPD for blindly firing into that apartment. The Attorney General, however, said that Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly and Detective Miles Cosgrove, that their use of force when they fired back at Kenneth Walker, he said that use of force was justifiable use of force. Of course, this is not the decision that many protesters have been calling for. Their specific cries were for all 3 of these officers to be arrested, charged, and put away in prison. Certainly the charge of wanton endangerment much lower than a charge of murder that they were calling for. However, Attorney General Daniel Cameron, he started out his news conference today. We just carried that live on our air. It lasted, what do you say, about 45 minutes to an hour?
45 to 50, yeah.
Yeah, and he said, every day this family, the family of Breonna Taylor, wakes up to the realization that someone they love is no longer with them. And he said, nothing I can do today or any day will change that. He said that this decision that he came down with today was not to decide if her death was a tragedy. He said that is unequivocally yes. He said that for this decision, he had to put emotions aside to determine if, based on the evidence, if criminal actions led to her death. And of course, we know that none of these officers have been charged with her death. So his determination was that there was no criminal activity other than that of Brett Hankison, who has been indicted for wanton endangerment. Just a few questions that we had leading up to today. There were many questions, of course, as to what transpired that night. The Attorney General saying that officers both knocked and announced their presence. He said that the evidence that they found concludes that. He said the evidence showed that they both knocked and announced, and said that it was corroborated by a nearby witness at that apartment complex, someone who was perhaps standing on the staircase right above. Another question was, was there any video that caught this incident at all? And he said that the only video that exists begins when area patrol officers arrived on scene after the shooting had occurred. We also are learning that, those 10 rounds that Brett Hankison, allegedly fired into these apartments blindly, that he said that no conclusive evidence suggests that the bullets from Hankison's gun struck Breonna Taylor. He says that the FBI was able to conclude that the fatal shot was fired by Detective Miles Cosgrove. And, he talked a little bit about how difficult, Locke, this was to piece together, because there were so many bullets. I think he said Hankison fired 10 rounds. Mattingly fired 6 shots. Detective Cosgrove shot 16 times. And Kenneth Walker fired at least 1 shot, that hitting Sergeant Mattingly in the femoral artery. He said that KSP was unable to determine, who fired the fatal shot that killed Breonna Taylor. He said she was shot 6 times, but they were not able to determine who fired that fatal shot. He then had to have it sent off to the FBI, and the FBI was able to conclude that the fatal shot was in fact fired by Detective Miles Cosgrove. And of course, he determined then that the actions of those 2 officers were justified.
Yeah, and again, we're just still taking it in. We are getting some reaction, though. John Mattingly's lawyer has released a statement after the grand jury announced their decision, and it said, quote, "The grand jury's decision to not indict Sergeant Mattingly or Detective Cosgrove shows that the system worked and that grand jurors recognized and respected the facts of the case. The death of Breonna Taylor is a tragedy, but these officers did not act in a reckless or unprofessional manner. They did their duty, performed their roles as law enforcement officers, and above all, did not break the law." That a statement from Kent Wicker, the attorney for Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, who was the one who was shot on the night of March 13th by Kenneth Walker. And as you mentioned, the things we know now that perhaps people speculated otherwise, it has been confirmed that it was Kenneth Walker's shot that hit Jonathan Mattingly. It was a 9mm shot that hit Mattingly, and LMPD police used 40mm ammunition that night. So the idea that perhaps the LMPD one of them had accidentally shot another, that not a friendly fire situation. Kenneth Walker acknowledged firing first. Again, as Kayla mentioned, the idea that the police did not only knock, but there was a witness that they did identify themselves is a major kind of new piece of information. And then in the end, it all just leads up to the fact that in the opinion of the grand jury, with the facts they were presented, it was justifiable return fire by the police officers, and they did not break the law. So we see, as again, there are changes that have occurred due to this. There are changes that will occur due to this in terms of police reform. There are still investigations underway on other officers in the force. There's certainly an investigation about how and why that warrant was obtained in the way it was. The Attorney General, in fact, Kayla, saying he's going to start a task force that statewide is going to look into how search warrants are obtained. There's already been changes in the settlement with the city of Louisville and the Taylor family that all the warrants have to be signed off by a commanding officer now. So certainly there's going to be additional scrutiny on body cameras, making sure that officers have those on, so we don't end up in a situation where even now when we have all the facts, there's still so many things that we don't know about that night. And just an additional thing that occurs to me, we're in a culture where there's so much distrust of authority that even as Daniel Cameron asks people to trust the facts, there will be people who say, we don't believe that these are the facts. That's the unfortunate reality we are in now with scrutiny and controversy around authority figures and some of the decisions and announcements that are made.
Yeah, and so the big question now is what happens now? We've been talking leading up to this announcement today. We've been talking about some of the preparations in Louisville and beyond. Of course, officials expecting widespread protests regardless of what this decision was. However, we want to let you know that Louisville is still under a state of emergency. The mayor also issued an order restricting access to downtown parking garages and on-street parking. He also issued a county-wide curfew. This affects all of Jefferson County, and it will be in place from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. for the next 72 hours. Now, that does not apply to those who are going to and from work. It does not apply to those seeking medical attention, and it does not apply to those who are going to places of worship. And in fact, officials with the city of Louisville encouraged churches today to remain open this evening and the following evenings. They said even for just an hour, to be a place where people can come and seek healing. Now, protesters, of course, have gathered in downtown Louisville. There are quite a few concrete barriers up to keep vehicular traffic out. And Interim Chief Robert Schroeder earlier today said that it is not to hinder people from practicing their First Amendment rights. It is to keep them safe while they are exercising their First Amendment rights. So he's also encouraging protesters heading to Jefferson Square Park to use rideshare. In the meantime, they've really beefed up their police presence. All LMPD officers' vacation time as well as their off days have been canceled. They said that they have resources distributed throughout the entire metro. And he made it clear, he said, quote, "We will not tolerate any violence or destruction of property." As far as a local and state and federal response, there are multiple local departments who have come in to assist LMPD, KSP, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, St. Matthews Police Department, Jeffersontown Police Department. That's some of the local response. However, they're also getting some federal help, the FBI, ATF, all here to help out LMPD today. And Kentucky National Guard, they were not able to tell us the exact number of soldiers who are responding to Louisville. However, we do know that they have been called in and will have a presence here.
We should also mention, by the way, that all JCPS athletic events, practices, games were canceled for the night, just to keep things safe. And quite honestly, Kayla, there was a fear on some parts that if this decision did not come down the way that the protesters hope, that it would be the match that would light a fire and that the entire city would erupt in violence. That has not occurred to our understanding yet. Obviously, it's still a very fresh situation. There's still a lot of pieces in place, but from what we've been able to see with our crews out there, thus far, most of the protesting has been relatively calm.
Here will be live at 4 with Charles Booker and Cabinet Secretary J. Michael Brown.
And we're getting some information from our control room that Governor Andy Beshear will be addressing the Commonwealth at 4 o'clock.
His regular press briefing, and he'll be joined by Charles Booker and J. Michael Brown, and so additional reaction will occur. This, of course, the governor's regular 4 p.m. coronavirus press briefing, but obviously there are other issues in play that he will address today. Of course, we will bring you that briefing live here on Spectrum News 1. If you're out and about, you can also find all of our coverage on the free Spectrum News app, or you can watch it on your phone or mobile device. We see Mario Anderson is now in downtown Louisville at Jefferson Square Park, and we'll get the latest from him. Mario.
Hey, well, good afternoon, Lachlan. As you can see, and as you said, we're here inside Jefferson Square Park, the epicenter of where these protests have been happening here in downtown Louisville for many, many weeks. And as you can tell right behind me, the crowd is pretty much subdued. There is some music being played in the background, but also a lot of people are just kind of taking in the moment that has happened and followed since the announcement was delivered in the indictment was announced just a short while ago. And I'm being joined right now by Jasmine. She's been here throughout the day. And Jasmine, let's talk first. What brought you out here this afternoon here to Jefferson Square Park?
It would definitely be the fact that all of the announcements today honestly didn't have anything to do with Breonna Taylor's death. The Class D felony has to do with other people who didn't even die. And it's just really upsetting, really frustrating. I'm not surprised. I'm just angry.
And share with our viewers who are watching with us across the state, when you were listening in as that announcement was here, several hundred other people, what was going through your mind as you're hearing what was the announcement was being made?
I think the Attorney General has a lot of nothing to say. Literally nothing. Spent a whole time doing facts over feelings. I felt like I was watching a YouTube video from the alt-right. It was just weird. It's just very weird, and it's weird how all of us out here can see what's going on, and people just continue to choose to ignore it.
Last question for you. What's your plan for the rest of the afternoon? Do you plan to stay in this area? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I think a 9 p.m. curfew is stupid. I think that it's 72 hours, so for the next 3 days, I also think that's stupid. I think that the fact that they've closed down such a large portion of downtown, considering Injustice Square is such a small part, I think that's silly. And I think that it's specifically designed for that when stuff starts to get a little, let's say, happening. It starts popping off. To trap us from our cars, because the walk to my car is almost a mile. It's ridiculous. But it's basically designed to keep us down here so that we can't escape, so that they can eventually arrest us for when they start agitating us.
Well, Jasmine, we appreciate you sharing your experience with us this afternoon.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, of course, we'll be continuing to monitor the developments happening here inside Jefferson Square Park in downtown Louisville and bring you more updates as we have them throughout the afternoon. We'll send it back to you in the studio.
All right, Mario, I don't know if you can hear us, but I'm just curious. It seems from the pictures we're seeing that it's relatively calm out there. I know there was a lot of fear that people would just erupt in anger. From what I'm seeing behind you, it doesn't look like anger. Is that showing up in pockets or mainly people being calm?
As of right now, most people are being calm, but there were several hundred of the people that were down here that shortly after the announcement was made, they immediately made their way down down 6th Street here in downtown Louisville and started to begin their protest throughout the downtown streets here. So many of those several hundreds that were here just a couple of hours ago, they have dispersed and are walking throughout downtown. But the people that are remaining here, they're just kind of, again, taking in the live music. There's free food being offered, drinks for people to be hydrated, and then they're just kind of hanging out and, again, once again, taking in the moment of the announcement that was made earlier this afternoon.
All right, thank you. Our Mario Anderson live in downtown Louisville here on Spectrum News 1.
Yeah, and we've heard that many protesters who began their day at Jefferson Square Park have been walking around downtown, but they also went through Smoketown, Germantown, and are currently making their way to the Highlands. We do have reporters on the ground there. I believe is that David Guilford, is that who we're going to now? Okay, David Guilford, he is live in the Highlands where he is monitoring the situations. soon. So we'll check in with him momentarily. He's going to bring us a report talking about the situation there. When this first happened, I can only imagine that at Jefferson Square Park, when that decision came down, it was like, a vacuum, just the air, taken out of everyone. I saw a lot of comments on Twitter and elsewhere that for a minute it was just silence. That just people taking in that moment of what that meant for them. Again, we've been talking about how, many people who have been marching in the streets for more than 115 days now, this was not the outcome they wanted to see. Of course, we just heard from our Mario Anderson, who talked to a protester at Jefferson Square Park. And she mentioned that, this is absolutely what they did not want to see. She said that she really felt like the outcome today had nothing to do with Breonna Taylor's death because no one was charged in her death. And ultimately, that's what many of these protesters were seeking.
And that's what certainly Daniel Cameron was aware of, that this outcome was going to be an unpopular decision among large portions of the population, and certainly nationally as well. As you mentioned numerous times, Breonna Taylor's name has become a national rallying cry. On the Emmy Awards, some of the winners literally had shirts that had her name on it. This is going to advance the narrative that justice was not given for Breonna Taylor. The Attorney General said justice comes when you follow the facts and you follow the truth and you follow the law. So these are going to be conflicting narratives. What happens in our society is usually the more frustrated and aggrieved parties tend to make the most noise. And so that is probably going to get a lot of attention. And you wonder, we're going to wait and see. Again, I'm encouraged, quite frankly, personally, by the reaction thus far, but it still feels so fresh. We almost couldn't believe when they were announcing the charges, just given what the expectations were, and Judge O'Connell read the 3 counts of wanton endangerment against Brett Hankinson, and then that was it. And we were just found ourselves going, really? That's it? And I'm sure that feeling is magnified even more so among the protesters. And you wonder, with a night to think about it or galvanize or mobilize, how different tomorrow will be. That's why, obviously, the mayor has put that 72-hour curfew, I think, in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to go over some of the restrictions that are in place in downtown Louisville and beyond. Again, you mentioned the curfew. That goes from 9 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. That is Jefferson County wide. That has been issued by executive order from Mayor Greg Fisher. He has issued a state of emergency for the city of Louisville. He's also restricted access to downtown parking garages and on-street parking. And, of course, Louisville Metro Police Department, they have restricted traffic in much of downtown Louisville. You'll be encountered by many concrete barriers if you're trying to get downtown. He said those have been put in place to protect people who are there exercising their First Amendment rights. However, as we heard from one of the women there that was talking to our Mario Anderson, she really felt like some of these measures have been aggravating protesters rather than feeling to them like it was a step taken to protect them. Many of them feel like this is hindering their First Amendment rights. It's hindering people from getting downtown. LMPD is asking those who are heading to Jefferson Square Park to ride share. And the Louisville mayor, he's asking people who are protesting to do so, before it's nighttime, essentially, because by 9 p.m. they want everyone cleared out. We've seen in previous instances when there has been a curfew implemented, that doesn't always happen. There will be some who follow it, and there will be some who choose to stay out past that 9 o'clock. Now, what happens after that, I don't know what procedures they're going to have in place. But we do know that LMPD has, many officers out and about. They have canceled all vacation days. They've canceled all off days. And they are also getting the help from not only many local departments, such as the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, J-Town Police Department, St. Matthews Police Department, and the Kentucky State Police, but they're also getting federal resources to respond to what has been expected of mass protests. They're getting help from the FBI, ATF, and also the Kentucky National Guard. I have just recently received a picture, and it was of a Guard helicopter that was going over Attorney General Daniel Cameron's Louisville field office. I'm told that it did not land, that it appears that perhaps they were just checking on the office there. Earlier, I tweeted out some photos. There were some signage that went up outside of his Louisville field office that is in, kind of the Hurstbourne area. That were erected overnight, saying private property, stay off. Of course, that office is in a shared office building. It's not a standalone field office. It is a suite within an office building. So there are other facilities there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we will see what happens when sun sets tonight in Louisville. When these protests first began, that was when it got really bad, quite honestly, in downtown Louisville. And there was a lot of vandalism, and there was a lot of property destruction, and there were those who felt that the police were too lenient in the early part of the protests in terms of letting destruction of property occur. It does feel like that they have come out with a little bit more of an active, proactive approach that says violence and property destruction will not be allowed in downtown Louisville tonight, and that's what the police are going to be certainly on high alert for now that they have a curfew in place as well that begins at 9 p.m., as you mentioned, Kayla, and goes till 6:30. They've got additional enforcement measures at their behalf, but again, we will see. Thus far, again, none of the officers charged with, in terms of the death of Breonna Taylor, just Brett Hankison, who was charged with wantonly endangering the lives of 3 other people in an apartment next to Breonna Taylor's, where his bullets went through and hit there. We were only identified those people by their initials, CE, CN, and ZF. Those are the 3 people that Brett Hankison was first-degree wantonly endangered with extreme indifference to human life. Again, he was assigned a $15,000 full cash bond. And as Kayla has been pointing out, these charges are Class D felonies, 1 to 5 years in prison. There's also some fines that could come in. Of course, Hankison's attorney still wants his job back. I mean, they are still appealing even the fact that he's been fired. So there's that certainly line of appeal that we will be following as well. But Attorney General Daniel Cameron said they are going to prosecute Hankison to the fullest extent of the law, given that he is the only one at this point that was indicted and is the only one that can be prosecuted. So you would imagine they would put all their resources in symbolically to trying to get a result against him.
Yeah, and we know just from reading the law that the fullest extent as far as time would be 5 years for each of those charges. I do want to read from Kentucky statute what wanton endangerment in the first degree is. And this is directly from the statute. It says, a person is guilty of wanton endangerment in the first degree when, under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life, he wantonly engages in conduct which creates a substantial danger of death or serious physical injury to another person. And of course, then it describes that wanton endangerment in the first degree is a Class D felony. Now, we have been watching protesters here at Jefferson Square Park, but we have reporters in various parts of Louisville as well as in Frankfort. But right now, we are going to check in with our David Guilford. He is near the Highlands. He's been following some protesters as they moved from downtown into the Smoketown and Germantown areas and are now headed towards the Highlands. David.
Yes, that's right. We have just moved from the Germantown area to the Highlands. We're just outside a business called The Fish House. It's a popular seafood restaurant in this area. I'm sorry the streets are pretty empty right now, but they were not just a moment ago. About a couple hundred protesters came down east on these streets. And what we didn't notice until shortly ago that police have been following them the entire way, but keeping their distance. They had their lights on, no sirens, and a couple dozen, or at least a dozen and a half cruisers, marked cruisers, following the group, but keeping their distance. No officers walking among the protesters, allowing them to move freely around the streets. Now, it's been a while since I have gone with a group this large before, and we have been to the Highlands, but we have been on a trek through South Louisville, moving that way, and then east into the Highlands. We don't know where the march is headed. We have seen them take a turn before in months past and head back north and back to Jefferson Square, but we're not sure right now how long it will go, but there's a lot of obviously impassioned people in the streets of Louisville right now. David Guilford reporting for Spectrum News.
And David, if you can hear us, I'd just like to ask your perspective, from what you have seen of these protesters as they've made this rather lengthy trek, have things remained peaceful?
So, to give a little bit of history briefly, when things became marches in weeks and months past, when they moved from Jefferson Square to the streets, that's when they released some of their tension that was built up in Jefferson Square. And I believe that's what we've seen here. Obviously, most people that we have heard from are not pleased with the results from the Attorney General and the grand jury. But this is nothing compared to the tension and yelling and emotion that we heard at Jefferson Square just a couple hours ago. There is music being played, obviously a lot of anti-police sentiment, but I've seen a lot more smiles out here on the streets compared to some tears and anger at Jefferson Square just a while ago.
And, Dave, we've been talking how, certainly many of these protesters are very disappointed with this outcome. Have any of them given you any indication as to what's next for them in this movement that they've been taking part in?
Well, the co-founders of Until Freedom addressed the crowd just minutes before the grand jury revealed their findings, and they said that they were going to maybe go home but continue the message and the work here in Louisville. And I don't believe that the protesters are done anytime soon. Some of the local leaders of the protesters here got on the mic shortly after the grand jury announcement, and they said that this is far from over, that they are going to continue marches like this and continue demonstrations. But I want to stress that at least a lot of the vocal leaders in the groups of protesters said it is important for people who gather to remain nonviolent. They can be angry, but they are aware that if they attack federal buildings especially, or police officers, that could cause more problems that they see than do good. So there are messages being sent like that, but obviously with a city this large and with a lot of people angry, not everyone has the same opinion or voice.
All right, David Guildford reporting live from the Highlands. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was good firsthand observation there, and again, encouraging news for those who feared that it would turn into a powder keg. You wonder, in addition to the frustration about the criminal activity not occurring the way the protesters had hoped, if there's a feeling that their protests were for naught, right? I mean, for 100 days plus, they've been advocating for a certain result, and then that result did not occur in their favor. And you wonder how they react to that going forward. Do they redouble their efforts, or does it just kind of dissipate and fade away? If David's report was accurate, the leaders of Until Freedom, which was one of the protest groups, they're going to leave town now. I mean, the story is over in some extent in the city of Louisville, because you are not now waiting for a decision. A decision has been made. It's not one that is the one the protesters wanted to see. But it will be so curious, and obviously it'll be a situation we follow here on Spectrum News 1 about how they deal with that. Do they get angry? Do they get sad? Do they get frustrated? Probably a combination of all those things. But do they continue their efforts in the days and weeks to come?
Yeah. And even though groups like Until Freedom, are perhaps leaving town, I will say that group in particular, they were driven by an education unit of teaching people, in Louisville how to protest, how to do so effectively. You just heard David talking there about how they are encouraging people to exercise their First Amendment rights, but to do so lawfully, because they're all about making that good trouble. And in fact, they've been hosting something called Good Trouble Tuesdays, and encouraging people to be disruptive but not to break laws. And so they've really been pushing people in that direction and really trying to educate people how to be effective in their protesting. And certainly many people have attended their classes, and I do think that that's something that will stay even after they leave. If you're just joining us, we do want to let you know that the grand jury did give the report to a Jefferson County judge today and did decide to indict former LMPD officer Brett Hankison. He has been indicted on 3 counts of wanton endangerment in the first degree. That is a Class D felony. Attorney General Daniel Cameron saying that the other two officers who fired shots the night that Breonna Taylor was killed, Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly and Detective Miles Cosgrove, he said that their use of force was justified. That, of course, being the decision of the grand jury that chose to not file charges against those officers. Right now, there are many protesters who have been taken to the streets over the last 115 plus days who are upset with this decision. They were calling, of course, for all three of these officers to be charged with murder, to be arrested and imprisoned, and to be fired from LMPD. The only one who has lost his job is the man you see right there. That is former Officer Brett Hankison, and he is the only one to face charges in this case as of now.
And again, we've been bringing you coverage on this issue since shortly after 1 o'clock here on Spectrum News 1. We will continue to stay on the air, taking you up to Governor Beshear at 4 o'clock. He will provide not just a coronavirus briefing, but obviously reaction from his office to the events of today. And Attorney General Daniel Cameron, again, he started his press conference by saying it's not his job to decide whether a tragedy occurred. Unequivocally, it's yes. He said it was his job to put emotions aside and investigate facts. And in fact, we saw an interview with one of the protesters, and she was disappointed. She said that Daniel Cameron was all about facts and not about feelings. I feel like Daniel Cameron would say that's exactly what he wanted to be about, was facts, not feelings. The facts that he presented today were that there was a corroborating witness, that police did identify themselves when they knocked on the door of Breonna Taylor's house, that the evidence shows that Kenneth Walker did fire first, and it was his bullet that hit Jonathan Mattingly in the leg, that Miles Cosgrove fired 16 shots, Mattingly 6 shots. Originally, LMPD could not identify the fatal shot that killed Breonna Taylor. The FBI crime lab, with some further analysis, did come to the conclusion that it was Miles Cosgrove's shot that was the fatal bullet that killed Breonna Taylor, and that it was one that acted almost immediately. Within a minute or two, she tragically lost her life. And then obviously Brett Hankison from outside fired 10 additional shots into not just Breonna Taylor's apartment, but through her apartment as well, into the apartment of a pregnant woman. And that was why Hankison, in the end, is the only one being charged. But when it all comes down to it, the grand jury ruled, and the Attorney General said that the officers were fired upon first and were justified in firing back, and therefore homicide was not on the table. The protesters said they needed to be charged. He said it's not on the table because they were justified in firing back. We've seen a statement. We'll probably revisit it here before 4 o'clock, but from the attorney of Jonathan Mattingly, which talked about vindication, and he said it was proof that Mattingly did not break the law. All right.
We are hearing from our delegation, our Kentucky delegation, Spectrum News 1's Eva McKinn, our Washington reporter. She has been gathering that for us, and let's go to her live. Eva.
Yeah, I've been running around the Hill trying to get reaction from Kentucky members. I haven't heard from all of them as yet, and their responses thus far have really been measured. They tell me things like, well, let's respect the grand jury decision. Congressman Andy Barr of Lexington, a Republican, telling me that this is a time to have a conversation about police reform, but none of them sort of engaging with this larger question of should the officers have been charged with murder. That is certainly what the protesters are calling for. That's what I asked them about, and they said that they really just respected the process. You can take a listen to Congressman Barr now.
Well, I don't have all of the news, but I did hear that there was a charge of wanton endangerment that was filed by the grand jury against one of the officers.
Right. It isn't a murder charge, and the family has been calling for that. So some on the ground there may feel like this is woefully inadequate. What is your message to them?
Well, my message to them is that look, the grand jury does its job. The judicial system does its job. Our job here is to make sure that we advocate for police reform that addresses legitimate grievances from the African-American community, while at the same time supporting community policing and responsible policing.
So I also spoke to Congressman Thomas Massey of Northern Kentucky and Congressman Brett Guthrie of Bowling Green. They're telling me that they're still waiting to comment. Congressman Guthrie reiterating that the situation itself is tragic, but didn't really want to elaborate further than that. He hadn't had the opportunity to see Attorney General Cameron's remarks, and he wanted to hold off on commenting further beyond saying that it was tragic in elaborating further than that. So we will see if this is the catalyst for more discussions about police reform. Of course, we had a police reform bill cleared the House, the Justice and Policing Act, but that was not taken up by the Senate. The Senate had their own reform bill that Senate Democrats blocked from moving forward in a procedural process. We will see that if the protest to come following what I would imagine many are disappointed with, a decision that many are disappointed with, if we will see actual concrete reform as a result of the outcry that we know that we will continue to see. Lachlan?
All right, thank you so much. That's our Eva McKend live in Washington, D.C., catching up with Kentucky's congressional delegation. And measured, it seems to be the response thus far from almost everyone. It has been calm, subdued, moments of anger and frustration, obviously, among the protesters. But thus far, it has not turned into a worst-case scenario, given, as far as the protesters are concerned, the worst-case outcome from the criminal justice system.
Yeah, we do expect to hear comments from Governor Andy Beshear coming up at 4 o'clock this evening. We're going to bring that to you live. We also are getting reaction from Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly's attorney. He issued a statement about this. You know, Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, he was the officer who was injured during that shooting. He was shot in the femoral by Kenneth Walker. Here's a statement that he gave. He says, the grand jury's decision to not indict Sergeant Mattingly or Detective Cosgrove shows that the system worked and that grand jurors recognized and respected the facts of the case. The death of Breonna Taylor is a tragedy, but these officers did not act in a reckless or unprofessional manner. They did their duty, performed their roles as law enforcement officers, and above all, did not break the law. And of course, we expect to hear more reaction as the night progresses. Of course, this decision still very fresh and one that's been highly anticipated. And Attorney General Daniel Cameron, he actually addressed the time that it took to make this decision. And he said when prosecutors prematurely release information, he said it can poison potential jury pools, and that's just a risk that he was not willing to take. Now, if you're just joining us, ultimately, the grand jury returned with an indictment for former LMPD officer Brett Hankison. He has been charged with 3 counts of first-degree wanton endangerment, a Class D felony. However, the other officers were cleared. No one has been charged in Breonna Taylor's death. The Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, said that the actions and returning fire by Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly as well as Detective Miles Cosgrove, he has determined that those were justifiable.
And you wonder, is there any possible way that Mattingly could have known this was coming, having put out that Facebook post that he did a couple nights ago that got a lot of attention, where he sent out his condolences and sympathies to other law enforcement officers and criticized the command structure and the leadership of the police department, and saying that he knew at the time, and in fact, we reference it, that what he did that night, he called it legal, moral, and ethical. And I can't imagine he would have known what the grand jury was going to come back with, because he put that Facebook post out, Monday night, and the grand jury announced today here on Wednesday. But in the end, he was vindicated in terms of his understanding of what occurred that night. I do go back, Kayla, to this will come down to whether people trust the authorities. I mean, Daniel Cameron said repeatedly after he announced the decision and he explained the facts of the case, and he knew that it would not be received well. And he said things like, justice is not easy. I know not everyone will be satisfied, but if we act with emotion or outrage, there is no justice. That mob justice is not justice. It just becomes revenge. Cameron went on to say, our reaction says, what kind of society are we? Do we want to know the truth? The question is going to be if people consider what happened today the truth. There is just gotten to a point where there's a distrust in the government and in authority. You heard it from the protester that Mario interviewed. She just didn't believe in the outcome from today, which is going to be, it's going to make this obviously an ongoing story moving forward.
Yeah. And the ACLU released a statement, following Attorney General Daniel Cameron's announcement, saying in part, today's announcement is the latest miscarriage of justice in our nation's long history of denying the Black Lives Matter. Once again, a prosecutor has refused to hold law enforcement accountable for killing a young black woman. Breonna Taylor should still be alive today. We join the Taylor family and the community in protesting and mourning the Commonwealth's choice to deny justice for Breonna. The executive director of the ACLU, Michael Aldridge, also said the ACLU will work with community leaders, activists, and elected officials to radically change policing so this never happens again. And of course, this reaction slowly starting to filter in since this decision just came down and was announced just within a couple hours ago. And within hopefully the next 15 minutes, we do expect to hear from Governor Andy Beshear as well as Kentucky Senator Charles Booker. And in fact, that's right now where we find our Joe Ragusa standing by. He's at the Capitol.
Thank you. Yeah, we're here at the Capitol waiting for a press conference from Governor Andy Beshear, along with State Representative Charles Booker and Cabinet Secretary J. Michael Brown. They're going to talk about their reactions to the Breonna Taylor announcement from the grand jury and from Attorney General Daniel Cameron. There wasn't a whole lot of information available on the press advisory, and we knew beforehand that Beshear was going to react to it, but he's going to use his time at his normal 4 o'clock update to do so. Also with Charles Booker here, we're definitely going to ask about what can be done at the state level, if anything, to amend laws to possibly hold police more accountable. Police reform is one of the subjects being talked about in a possible special session. So it's one of those things that Governor Beshear has talked about a little bit in the past before, but we'll see if there's any more movement on topics like that. J. Michael Brown has also talked about the investigation into a lot of the other activities going on in Louisville as well. So his role will also talk about that. And generally speaking, we'll see exactly what their reaction is to everything that happened. And again, what could possibly be done to change the criminal statutes even to see if, there is room for more police reform or more police accountability, or if they feel like justice was actually properly administered in this case. But either way, that's going to start in about 15 minutes here, close at 4 o'clock, in lieu of his regular coronavirus update. I'm sure we'll also hear some of the numbers from today's update as well as a reaction to the Breonna Taylor investigation. But again, we'll have that for you all at 4. For now, reporting at the Capitol, Joe Ragusa, Spectrum News.
All right, Joe, thank you. And we do want to bring you an update. This just into our newsroom. We've been able to confirm that all sports today for JCPS have been canceled. This, of course, as the city braces for widespread protests. Again, the city of Louisville currently under a state of emergency. The mayor also restricting access to downtown, parking garages, as well as on-street parking. And there also has been a county-wide curfew that has been issued. That goes from 9 p.m. this evening until 6:30 tomorrow morning. It will continue for the next 72 hours. That curfew does not apply to those going to or from work, those seeking medical attention, or anyone going to places of worship. In fact, the city pausing today during their announcement to encourage churches to remain open at least for some time during this evening and some of the nights that follow, just to give people that place for healing, as it's very clear that there are a lot of people who are hurting right now in Louisville.
And Joe mentioned, we'll see if additional legislation or reform efforts come out of today's decision. There will be those who say the system worked exactly as it was supposed to work today, that police serving a legally obtained warrant were fired upon and returned fire in the course of doing their job, and therefore they should not be charged. So there will be those who say the system worked as it was supposed to work today, but I think the issue certainly brought up in the context of all the other issues, the idea of police reform and accountability and identifying rogue or bad officers and making sure that they don't have opportunities to commit crimes. That is something that will come out of this going forward. In fact, as part of the settlement with the Taylor family, the $12 million settlement announced just recently, I'm just looking through this list of policy changes: a housing credit program to incentivize officers to live in low-income areas, officers to do 2 hours a week of paid community service, creating a program to include social workers at LMPD, requiring commanding officers to review all search warrants before judicial approval, additional protocols for money seizure, expanding random drug testing, more records on officers who leave the force while under investigation, and an early warning system to track use of force incidents. All those are police reforms that are going to occur as a result of the Breonna Taylor tragedy. That on top of Breonna's law passed by Metro Louisville banning no-knock warrants and requiring police officers not just to have body cameras, but to have them turned on. So when you look at the reform in that level, it does feel like, you know, things are happening. But as Joe mentioned, there will certainly be some calls for more things to happen. I think everyone can agree, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, that you would want to take any steps you possibly can to make sure a tragedy like this does not occur again.
Mm-hmm. And we are. Then this right here is video from earlier this afternoon. You can see protesters gathered there. Things that there appearing to be largely peaceful. We are expecting to hear more from Governor Andy Beshear here in perhaps the next 10 minutes. Senator Charles Booker is expected to talk with him. Now, several weeks ago, I did talk to Senator Charles Booker, and I asked him what justice for Breonna truly meant. And I want to read a quote from him that I used in that story that I did with him. He said, quote, "Justice for Breonna Taylor is not only about accountability in the incident that took her life, it's also about investing in our communities in dealing with the institutional and structural racism that allows incidents like that to even happen." He says it means that we are finally committed to the people of Kentucky and that we're not going to look away anymore. The fact that we're dealing with concentrated poverty and the issues of gentrification is because communities have been abandoned. Justice for Breonna means we're not going to do that anymore. And certainly, I think that many of the things that he said, you know, when I did that interview with him, I think that is something that many people, not only in Louisville, but beyond Louisville, feel as we talk about how Breonna Taylor's name has become this rallying cry for those who would like to see police reform and other reforms take place all across our nation that uplift those who've been marginalized in our society. And so I'm sure we'll hear some of those sentiments from him this evening as he joins Governor Andy Beshear in his briefing.
And it is important to point out, and again, I'm Lachlan McLean, joined by Kayla Moody here live on Spectrum News 1, that there is still a federal investigation ongoing into the process of how the search warrant was obtained for Breonna Taylor's apartment that night. That kind of sometimes gets lost in the shuffle with obviously the tragedy that occurred, but there are a lot of questions about why and how and was accurate information used to actually get that search warrant. So that is an investigation that is ongoing. So that may be a way to provide some kind of relief for the protesters who feel like more should be done. It's important to point that out. And something else that Kayla and I discussed earlier, but if you weren't with us about an hour ago, one of the more interesting moments in the press conference, I thought, with the Attorney General was a question about how, according to the Attorney General, when Detective Mattingly opened the door, Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker were right next to each other, with Kenneth Walker in a gun out in a shooting position, who fired a bullet, and the detectives returned fire. 6 shots from Mattingly, 16 from Miles Cosgrove. And Breonna Taylor was hit 6 times, and Kenneth Walker was hit 0 times. And how physically can that happen if they were in the same area? And that was the one area I thought where the Attorney General was very, very vague, did not provide much insight or guidance. He said that's obviously a tragedy that occurred, but I think people are going to want to know, beyond that, specifically, how could 2 people standing next to each other, one be shot 6 times and one not be shot at all? I feel like that's going to be an issue that's going to require follow-up here in the days and weeks to come.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to note that he really did stick to, what he said the evidence showed throughout his presentation this afternoon. And that was the one question that he seemed to not know how to answer, so to speak. He seemed to be tap dancing around it a little bit. And so that's a question that still needs to be answered, especially since we do know that the officers saw Kenneth Walker with his arms extended, gun out. It begs the question of, how does the person next to him, suffer all the gunfire. One of the things that the Attorney General announced is that he is creating a task force to review the process for obtaining and executing search warrants in Kentucky. He did note that the scope of his investigation did not look into the process of how that search warrant, that no-knock search warrant, was obtained. That will be handled by the FBI. And I do think that Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly really alluded a little bit to the FBI investigation in the email that he sent all LMPD officers overnight Tuesday, because I want to read one of the lines that he includes here. He says, he's referring to officers, police officers, and he says, the position that if you make a mistake during one of the most stressful times in your career, the department and FBI go after you for civil rights violations. Your civil rights mean nothing, but the criminal has total autonomy. And so, it makes you wonder if perhaps he's now setting his sights on that civil rights violation, or not civil rights violation, but civil rights investigation, knowing that there are still steps left in this process.
All right, these are live pictures now from Bardstown Road in the Highlands section of Louisville. As you can see, people are starting to congregate together there. I'm being told we're going to take a brief time out before we join the governor's press conference. We'll keep going. I thought I heard the word break, but no break here. We are going to continue to take you right up until 4 o'clock when, again, the governor, along with Charles Booker and J. Michael Brown, will give their reaction. You can see the protesters who have left Jefferson Square have made their way to the Highlands, or to where David Guilford is.
Bardstown Road in the Highlands of Louisville, if you can hear me. We are, as you can see, just on the side of the road. We were in the middle of the street where protesters met with a line of police, and then they shoved back and forth a little bit. Nothing too serious, but then another line of LMPD officers moved to flank the group on the sidewalk. And once that happened, then the crowd panicked, for lack of a better word, and dispersed. But someone must have gotten into it with police again, because I personally ingested tear gas, or some agent of that kind. We were coughing and eyes were watering for a little bit. So we can definitely confirm that some agent was released, but I don't see much smoke right now. It doesn't seem to have been released in too heavy of an amount like we saw back in late May, early June. I'll try and spin around here. You can see another line of police officers. This is where the protesters came from originally, and now police have blocked off this section of Bardstown Road. All the while, traffic is trying to get through still. Like it's a normal Wednesday, really.
All right, that's our David Guilford. Obviously, you could hear what he was saying. We had a little bit of problem with the transmission of the video, but a little brief skirmish he described between protesters and police. They've gotten out of the area, Kayla, that's cordoned off, where traffic is stopped. When they're in the Highlands, they're in just regular, as he said, Wednesday afternoon traffic. So, a little bit more complicated, I think, at that point. It's interesting, you mentioned all the LMPD out there. We're covering the angle, obviously, of the disappointment of the protesters. There's that other angle that the rank and file LMPD officers perhaps feel emboldened today, that they are not under fire as much as perhaps they feared they would be for the last 100 days, and how that will progress and move forward. Because obviously one of the angles of this is we have to improve the relationship between law enforcement and regular citizens. Everyone has acknowledged there are problems there, specifically, obviously, on a racial front. The police have felt under fire for months. You wonder if today's verdict, which is a vindication of the officers of that night, I don't know how, I would be remiss to speculate as far as how it changes, if at all, police conduct or behavior going forward. You hope it just provides further impetus for everyone to communicate and respect each other and I don't know, trust the process. I don't know. I don't know where still so many questions. We did get answers today, but we still are left with a lot of questions.
Yeah, work to be done on both sides, it would seem. Well, we do know that there are 3 orders in Louisville that are restricting vehicular traffic as well as pedestrian traffic, depending where you are. The city of Louisville is still under a state of emergency. Right now, we're taking a look at another live picture here. It looks like there is a protester being arrested, at least one protester, if not a few. Can I get some information on where this is? Is this in the Highlands?
Looks like Bardstown Road.
Yeah, it looks like Bardstown Road.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a Facebook Live video, and it's from Bardstown Road and.
Okay, Bardstown Road at Midland Avenue. Just as our David Guilford was reporting, things were pretty calm. They had remained calm from the time that protesters had left Jefferson Square Park, had gone through Smoketown, part of Germantown, and made their way to the Highlands. But shortly after arriving in the Highlands, he said that things took a slightly different turn. He said that things started growing more tense. There was some type of chemical agent released. David described his eyes burning, but did not see any kind of smoke in the air. So it's unclear if there was any kind of like pepper balls or what may have been used. So we will look to LMPD for more clarification on that as the night progresses. Right now the time is 3:59 Eastern. We are awaiting a news conference with Governor Andy Beshear that is scheduled to start at 4 o'clock, and we will bring that to you live when that happens. But for now, we are monitoring the situation in Louisville. Again, we've been talking for days now about how the city and the state has been preparing for what is believed to be ongoing widespread protests. You know, as we sit here in our studio, we can actually hear helicopters going over our station. I have received some pictures of helicopters belonging to the Kentucky National Guard flying over and assessing different situations. LMPD will certainly have their helicopter in the air.